Um, I think we are live. Uh, Welcome, everybody. Welcome to this fifth session of the Second International Seminar on Crusades and the Military Orders. My name is Clara Almagro, and it is my pleasure to chair this session. Before we start, some instructions. The talk will be given in English, and all participants are invited to post their questions through the YouTube chat channel, and they can do so not only in English, but also in Spanish and Portuguese, and we will translate it for the speaker. These practical instructions aside, now it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Gaposchkin, who received her PhD in medieval history from the University of California, Berkeley in 2001. And she has taught at Dartmouth College in Hanover, New Hampshire since 2000, and is now professor of history and chair of the department. She works mostly on medieval cultural and religious history, and she's the author of The Making of St. Louis, published by Cornell in 2018, Les Louis, Most Glorious Kings, published by the University of Notre Dame in 2012, and also Invisible Weapons Liturgy and The Making of Crusade Ideology, published also by University of Cornell in 2017. And a new book by her is due to appear soon, titled Vexilia Regis Gloriae, Liturgy and Relics at the Sainte-Chapelle in the 13th Century, which will be published by the Centre National de Recherche Supérieure in France this year. She was also elected a fellow of the American Academy in this year of 2021, and today she will speak on the cross of war in the age of Crusades. And Professor Gaposchkin, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Almagro, for that very nice introduction. And I want to thank Dirceu Marchini in particular for the invitation and for just the comedy in establishing a conference and trying to keep us all connected in this weird pandemic age. He and I have never met, but we've corresponded over the last few years, and it's really nice in this weird contracted age to be able to make new connections across time zones and geography. So really appreciate that and appreciate being invited to participate in this event here. Can we just confirm that you can see? There we go. Okay, so that is the title page of my talk, which is on the cross of war in the age of the Crusades, and it's really about carrying the relic of the true cross out into war during the Crusades onto the battlefield. So in the opening paragraph of his famous and lyrical bull, Audita Tremendi, calling the Third Crusade, Pope Gregory VIII explained that the King of Jerusalem went to meet Saladin in battle, carrying with him the relic of the true cross, which was then, along with the king, catastrophically captured by enemy infidel forces. Indeed, this was a fact rehearsed by contemporary authors and modern interpreters alike, that the Frankish army took into battle the most precious relic of the true cross, and that it was lost on the field, captured by Saladin, and ultimately never returned. So in the lead up to the battle, following the internal negotiations of the war council at Caesarea, Guy of Lusignan, the king, had instructed the patriarch Heraclius to bring him the true cross from Jerusalem, from the Holy Sepulchre, which the patriarch in turn, I'll give you the source here, the patriarch in turn brought forth from Jerusalem and entrusted to the prior of the sepulchre, instructing him to carry it in the host with the king, so to carry it out into battle. 2 days before the battle, on 2 July, Raymond III, the Count of Tripoli, is said to have rallied his companions with a speech saying that once we and our horses are refreshed with the Lord's cross aiding and protecting us, I want to come back to that language, we will valiantly defeat that faithless race. The army was advised that, once armed, they should march out in formation. Led by the Count of Tripoli at the vanguard, the army included the Templar formation as well as the, quote, formation of the Holy Cross and the formation of the King, which is to say that there was a division that was led by the Templars, one that was led by the King's standard, and one that was led by the standard of Christ himself. Witnesses would later recall entering battle, quote, armed with the sign of the cross. And Gregory VIII, back to Audita Tremendi a few years later, had stated that Guy took the relic into battle because, as he said, the Lord's cross was customarily a certain protection and a defense that was wanted against the attack of the pagans. Okay, so the episode at Hattin and the loss of the true cross is particularly well known for a number of reasons, because it was the prized relic from Jerusalem, venerated at the Holy Sepulchre itself, and its loss was particularly symbolic for the bigger material loss of Jerusalem and then the depredation of the crusading project to the Ayyubids in general. But it turns out, and I don't expect this will surprise most of people at this conference, any Crusade scholar, but it turns out that the carrying of a relic of the true cross into battle was actually a standard feature of crusading warfare and ideology. And the question is, why? Now, contemporary historians who mention the bearing of relics into battle will claim that the purpose is, or the effect is, something of a morale booster for troops, sort of sign of Christian comity and identity. And this is all certainly true from a sociological perspective, but this underplays, I think, something, this explanation, or this simple explanation, or only this explanation, underplays, I think, something pretty fundamental about the role that the relic itself, that a cross relic, was understood to play in the battle. What I want to argue here today is that the cross was understood as Christ's weapon against the devil, and as such was used as a shield and protection. But above all, the cross relic could be wielded actually as Christ's weapon in Christ's wars. So I want to take a moment and look at a couple of images unrelated of the harrowing of hell. These are a number of manuscript images from the 12th and 13th century from France and England, and they show, of course, Christ in the 3 days between his death and resurrection descending into hell to release the souls in limbo. And you can see that Christ is using the cross to spear here the mouth of hell, but here the devil, and over here as well the devil. And so Christ is sort of using in these images and in this mythology, the cross to defeat the devil. And that's what was said. Christ defeated death and the devil with the cross. Christ's agent in earthly wars, and in particular, we'll note the stories of Constantine and Heraclius that we'll come back to, the two emperors. Christ's agent in his earthly wars would then wield the cross against the enemies of Christ. So in the theology of the cross, that was then made visible, that was manifest in its histories, particularly of Constantine and Heraclius, and, as I will spin out for you, as instantiated in its liturgies, the cross itself is understood, it's modeled as a weapon of war. The cross relic as a battle standard, and more so as a weapon, more than anything, made earthly, the crusade as God's war and crusaders as God's warriors. So one way of thinking about this is that if the cross was Christ's weapon against the devil, and the Muslims were the so-called enemies of the cross, then the cross relic was the material node, or the material access, which connected the earthly battle to the great eschatological battle. So another way of thinking about it is that if the cross could beat Satan, it could certainly beat the Ayyubid army. So in the next 30 minutes, I want to go through a number of overarching arguments. Now, I've handed out to participants, just because I know how difficult multilingual conferences can be. When I'm not listening to a paper in English, I will often get lost, even if I know the language reasonably well. And so registered participants should have a copy of the text that I'll go through. Broadly speaking, the four pieces of the argument in an overarching way are the following. It's what I'm going to argue in the next 35 or so minutes. The first is that Christ conquered, theology and liturgy had established the cross as the means by which Christ had conquered death, the world, and the devil, and as such it was understood as a protection and a weapon. We've just touched on that. The second point I want to make is that in the earlier period, in the period before the discovery of the true cross, and thus the existence of cross relics, the hermeneutics of the cross permitted the cross's power to slip or extend between the earthly realm and the heavenly realm. My third overarching point is that after the discovery of the true cross in the 320s, the date is disputed, cross relics, because of their material form and because of their immense earthly value as a commodity, they crystallized the eschatological power as a transcendental weapon. And so cross relics were then deployed, if you will, as a material weapon in earthly battles. And my fourth point, which follows, of course, is that with the advent of the crusade and the adoption of the cross as the symbol of the crusades and the crusading opponent as enemies of the cross, the use of the cross relic on the battlefield was doubly powerful and would become a common practice of armies. What follows is 4 sections to this argument, and I give them to you here so that you can sort of know where I am as I'm moving through the different elements of the argument. A section on the period before 324, a section on the period after 324, something about the language of the cross, particularly in the liturgy, and then how this applies to the Crusades. So let's begin with the first point, the period before 324, 327. The practice of carrying cross relics into war was at root and irrevocably infused with the power of the story of Constantine's battle against the Emperor Maxentius, despite the fact that Constantine himself could not possess a cross relic to carry into battle because it hadn't been uncovered yet. Even before Constantine's conversion, Christian writers had equated the Roman triumphal symbol of the military tropaeum, the trophy, with Christ's victory through the cross. Very early on, in what would turn out to be a kind of metonymy for much Christian theology, the meaning of the cross was inverted from a symbol of passion, suffering, execution, and shame to that symbol of victory and triumph. So early Christian authors like Justin Martyr, Minucius Felix, and particularly Tertullian, in refuting the pagan critique that Christians worshipped a criminal that had been shamefully executed on the cross, they argued that the cross was actually glorious. The issue here was the shape or the form, the signum of the cross, not the relic, not the actual material of the cross, which in any event hadn't been discovered yet. Justin Martyr said that the image of the cross in its shape was not itself disreputable because we could find it anywhere in the masts of ships, in the farmer's plow. Tertullian wrote that Christ triumphed through the victory of the cross, through the trophaeum, which was in any event a Roman victory monument upon which the enemy's weapons were hung even during the Republican period. So it's an image of universal Roman military domination is associated with the cross. But it was Eusebius of Caesarea, the heir to those apologists, writing after Constantine's remarkable victory in 312, who transformed the idea of the cross as a trophy and a sign into the war banner, the labarme, or the military standard, the very thing that a military general would carry into battle with him. So according to Eusebius, before the Battle of Constantine, this is all well known, Constantine had a vision of a cross-shaped trophy, there's that language again, in the sky with the text hanging from it that read, "In this you will conquer." Christ then in a dream vision told Constantine to use a copy of that sign as a protection, quote, as a protection against the attacks of the enemy, right? The military, the earthly enemy. And the emperor then set, quote, the victorious trophy at the head of his escorting soldiers. And after this, immediately, the image of the cross is associated with imperial military victory. For his part, Lactantius, writing in Latin, explained that Constantine was advised to mark the heavenly sign of God on the shields of the soldiers and then engage in battle. And the language he used here is armed with the sign of the cross, the army took up its weapons. And so the sign itself, the image of the cross here becomes an armament, a part of weaponry. At roughly the same time, but on an entirely different register, the cross itself was being framed as Christ's battle standard. In this case, his war banner, his vexillum in his battle against the devil. And it's going to take a few years for these two lines of vocabulary to come together and to merge, such that the vexillum of the cross is the banner of warfare in the Crusades. That's right. So this brings me to my second section. Because everything we've talked about was well before the discovery of the actual true cross and the rapid dispersal of cross relics throughout Christendom. Now, a relic of the cross in its material, portable, and transferable form was something qualitatively different from merely an image of the cross. The relics of the saints, as Peter Brown has taught us, and in his famous opening line to the book, The Cult of the Saints, the relics of the saints joined heaven and earth. And in their praesentia, in their very presence, relics functioned in this as a kind of lightning rod to secure the power of heaven into the temporal sphere. So an early report from about 400 claimed that Constantine's mother, Saint Helena, who was reputed to have been the one who discovered the true cross in Jerusalem, apparently she sent holy nails from the cross to Constantine for him to place it in his helmet and in the bridle of his war horse. And it's only at this point that relics, rather than mere images of the cross, relics that are not, in fact, even often formed in the shape of a cross, made their appearance and went into circulation. So in Constantinople, ever cognizant of Constantine, Byzantine emperors sought to harness the power of their relics, including especially cross relics. Their prestige was such that lesser princes often wished possession as well. So in 567, the Merovingian Queen Radegund received from the Emperor Justin II a fragment of the true cross, for which the poet Venantius Fortunatus composed that very famous hymn, Vexilla Regis Prodeunt, meaning the battle standard of the king, and the king here is, of course, Christ. And so here you have the idea of the cross relic being associated again with Christ's battle standard, the coming together of those two sets of languages. Justin also sent a cross relic to the Pope, to Rome. The famous reliquary, which I'm showing you here, is perhaps the oldest surviving reliquary, an extant reliquary, cross reliquary. And amazingly, it bore the inscription, "The wood by which the human Christ defeated the enemy." And again, this is really early use of this language of subduing or defeating, in this case, the eschatological enemy. The association between imperial military victory and the cross established by Constantine was, of course, redoubled in 629 when the Emperor Heraclius retrieved the relic of the true cross, which had been taken from Jerusalem by the Persian king Khosroes II. And in defeating Khosroes and his army, Heraclius returned the relic in triumph to the Holy City. The story spread like wildfire. It was incredibly popular. That event and the relic's subsequent transferal to Constantinople in the wake of the Arab invasions spurred adoption of the feasts of the invention of the cross on May 3rd and the exaltation in both Byzantium and particularly in the West, which I'm going to attend to later. I feel like we need a breather. Normally I would ask the audience at this point if everybody was with me. So I hope you're following along. I hope this is clear. So even before Heraclius, by the 6th century, the Byzantine emperors had made a practice of carrying cross relics into battle. So we know from Byzantine ceremonial sources that at least 2 of the palace's cross relics were specifically associated with the history of Constantine. In the 9th century, another Constantine, a man named Constantine Porphyrogenitus, Constantine the 7th, in a tract called the De Ceremoniis, which he wrote for his son about military practice military practice, he wrote about how the emperor marched behind the Publicarius, kind of chamberlain, who, quote, carried the holy and life-giving wood of the cross in a theke, in like a reliquary or a case around his neck, alongside another officer who bore another cross. In 1176, Manuel I brought a cross relic on campaign into Iconium. In 1190, Isaac II Angelos brought one into Sipka. Anton Frollo, in his amazing magisterial study of the dispersal of cross relics throughout the Christian world, traced further this practice among Slavic and Russian and Bulgarian and Germanic kings and emperors into the 11th and 12th centuries, presumably here just an imitation of Byzantine practice. In the West, we have the example of the Concilium Germanicum, an ecclesiastical council of the 8th century, emperor by the order of the Emperor Carloman, making an effort to regulate clerics when clerics can bring relics onto the battlefield. And Michael McCormick traced the practice among Visigothic kings, perhaps as early as the 7th or 8th century, of carrying out into battle a great golden cross that contained a cross relic. Interestingly here, the liturgical ceremony for departure to war had the Visigothic king coming up to the altar to fetch the cross before going to war, during which the clergy would sing out, "Take up the invincible shield of justice for vengeance against your enemies. For your power was given to you by the Lord, and your strength in the Most High for vengeance against the enemies." And here I just want to pause on this language of the language of vengeance and power over this cross relic as it's leaving for war, how it's ritually and liturgically instantiated within the war-making context. This brings me to the question of the language around, the hermeneutics around the cross as a protection and a weapon, because it is to the field of liturgy and its associated religious texts that we can look if we want to understand more broadly the hermeneutics of the cross, and especially cross relics. And I do make a distinction, as the medieval authors make a distinction, between signum, the sign of the cross, and the lignum, the wood of the cross, that is the material thing. If we want to understand the role that the cross relics, why that this encouraged military leaders to carry cross relics into war. Now, theologians and preachers across the centuries had insisted that the cross, we've already seen this at the crucifixion, had been a weapon with which Christ defeated the devil. This goes back to Colossians and seesaws between the devil himself and affiliated dark forces on earth. So Christ, in Colossians it says, Christ, having despoiled the principalities and powers, made a show of them openly, triumphing over them on the cross. The idea of fighting both visible and invisible enemies was also rooted in the language of scripture and early theology, but it was the liturgy, as far as I can tell, that really activated these ideas upon the cross in a context of venerating and using cross relics in particular, because it was the liturgy that developed a language of power and militantism to describe and understand the meaning of the cross within the sphere of history and eschatology. That's where the liturgy is the place, the sphere where this gets worked out. So Heraclius's victory and retrieval of the cross relic in 629 spurred the celebration of two feasts in the West that were dedicated to the cross relic itself. There's the invention of the cross, celebrated on May 3rd, and in particular the exaltation of the cross, celebrated on September 14th, which was specifically about venerating and celebrating the cross relic on the altar, the very relic that a church possessed. Now, the celebration of both feasts spread quickly in the West, starting in the 7th century, following on the news of the Heraclius's victory in the Latin world. The liturgical material for these feasts resituated the cross relic into a field of action as a protection and a defense in the context of both eschatological and earthly battle. And this is where the story of Heraclius becomes so important. So in the famed Vatican witness of the Gelasian Sacramentary, testifying that, so this is the manuscript that testifies probably to the earliest layer for the development of cross prayers for the feasts of the Invention and Exaltation. We can get the prayers will state that it is through the banner of the Holy Cross that your Son might help free us from the evils of war and maintain us in security and protection. And it describes the Holy cross as a weapon of justice, which can help crush the crimes of adversaries. I've given you the text there. That is, the prayers advance a notion that the cross relic, the actual material fragment of the cross, exists and performs within the sphere of war and battle. Similar formulations appear across a whole range of Latin liturgical sources that you can trace between the mid-8th and the 11th centuries. So another example I want to show you, which is right now in private hands, I like because it comes from Le Puy in the middle of the 11th century. And I like it because Adhemar of Le Puy, who's of course the ecclesiastical leader of the First Crusade, the papal legate who represents the church on the First Crusade, may well have used it. I mean, it comes from his church in his diocese. And in these prayers, you get the same themes. They ask God to free us from the evils of war through the standard of his son's holy cross, to defend us from the malignant enemy through the wood of the cross, and so forth. The Latin lectionary of the same period, which told the story of Constantine's victory at Milvian Bridge, read, on this day, God gave on this day a great victory to the King Constantine through the power of the Holy Cross. And I want to return to this phrase, the power of the Holy Cross, because we're going to come back to it. Virtus Sanctae Crucis. The notion of virtus is important. And here, of course, the author, the text is eliding the fact that Constantine didn't actually have a cross relic with him. In the 10th century, we find a blessing for the royal battle standard as the king marches out to war. This is the vexillum, which is also the word for the cross as Christ's battle standard. And this prayer talks about the defenders of the people of God through the power of the Holy Cross, there's that language again, who might rejoice to triumph, to acquire triumph and win victories against their enemies. And then a final one that I want to show you. This is the prayer book of Hildegard of Bingen. Another cross prayers was simply, defend me through the power of the Holy Cross from all my enemies, both visible and invisible. Now, by quoting this range of different prayers, I want to note several recurrent features of this language. The first is the idea of the virtus, power of the cross, in helping and defending, defeating, and conquering an enemy. The idea of visible and invisible enemies, because we have to attend to how this language permits the cross relics to do its work across multiple temporal and spatial registers. So in particular, it seems to me that the word virtus is malleable, indicating as it did both moral perfection, right, virtue or Christian faith, but also military fortitude. That is a kind of brute power or force which it can execute. Thus straddling and connecting the divine and the earthly. Framework is, of course, eschatological. The battle is primarily the battle against the devil, that is the ancient enemy, the antiquus hostis that appears all over the sources in so many of the prayers. But in this, the line is really very slippery because, of course, earthly battles were understood as worldly manifestations of the eschatological battle for the souls of mankind. And all the more so when the army was God's army and the enemy was, of course, the enemies of the cross. This is, of course, itself scriptural language taken from Philippians. This is all sharpened over time, wherein the cross takes upon itself increasingly earthly functions. So here we have the ancient enemy, the Satan, and his minions. And it is his minions who, in this context, were so awfully simply the holy other of Christian warfare. And of course, many people have written on how this piece of the ideology gets worked out. But it's this dual register, which means that the cross could fight both invisible and visible enemies. And that's why this phraseology of invisible and visible is so important as it begins to pop up really in the 9th and 10th century. And of course, it also means that this dual register permits the cross relic to work effectively as both a visible and invisible weapon on the battlefield. So in this vein, let me look at another prayer, further blessing from the Feast of the Exaltation of the Cross, which is again the September 14th, which feast specifically designed for veneration of the relic of the true cross, that praises God for conceding to Heraclius the triumph over Khosroes through the power of the cross, by which he conquered the ancient enemy, the devil. So here you have that language again. And in this militant formulation of the power of the cross is visualized in this totally remarkable image of Heraclius meeting his foe upon a bridge, which itself has to be evoking the story of Milvian Bridge as well, of Constantine. So this is from a royal prayer book from about 1320, and it marks the start of the Feast of the Exaltation. You can see that down here, the Feast of the Exaltation of the Cross. I want to show you a blow up of it, because we have Heraclius here using the cross itself, not as a shield, but really as a javelin, as a weapon to slay Khosroes' son on the bridge. And the liturgical text made the case clearly that just as Christ defeated Satan on the cross, so Heraclius defeated the Persians by the power of the cross. Cross is the linchpin that's going to connect the earthly and the heavenly. And just let me pause. This whole project started with this image. Working on a different project, I came across this image in this royal prayer book, and I was completely stunned by it. It seemed to be an inversion, such a clear formulation of all these ideas around the cross, the veneration of the cross, that I had been seeing in earlier work. And I find this image really incredibly evocative, but quite stunning. And it brings me actually nicely to my fourth topic, which is the how this all fits into the Crusades. So it is precisely because the cross was both a protection but also a weapon that Urban II chose the sign of the cross as the emblem of the Crusaders' vow in the first place in 1095, and why the image and the idea of the cross became so central to the ideology of crusading. And it is also why the cross relic became so important in the waging of war against the cross's enemies. That Pauline phrase again that became so central to the conceptualization of the crusading other, the crusading opponent. It seems to me utterly inevitable that utterly inevitable that the Crusaders would adopt with particular verve, particular commitment to this earlier practice of carrying cross relics into war. So let's return to Adhemar of Lepuix. Adhemar of Lepuix, the legate, papal legate, the spiritual leader of the First Crusade, seems to have brought a cross relic with him when he went east on campaign. Crusaders may have fought at Dorylaeum with it, the evidence isn't clear, but at Antioch in June of 1098, Adhemar led the Crusaders into battle against Caraboga, bearing the true cross along with the newly discovered Holy Lance at the vanguard. There's been a lot of discussion of the Holy Lance, so I just want to refocus on the cross relic. This is an image, a 14th century image. This is Adhemar here. You can tell because he's got this weird helmet, which kind of looks like a bishop's mitre. Some months later, and after Adhemar's death, before the walls of Jerusalem, this is in 1099, according to Raymond of Aguilera, Adhemar appeared in a dream to the priest Stephen of Valence, asking, I love this quote. So he says to Stephen, I speak of the cross, which was at my front ranks. Let it be carried in the army. Tell me, what relic is better than a cross relic? Tell me really, what is there better than a cross relic? What other relic is better than a cross relic? So the Franks then bore cross relics in their famous pre-battle procession held in July 8th, the week before the capture of the city, when they, toured, they perambulated the city of the Holy City. And then after the capture of Jerusalem in 1099, one of the first things the victorious Crusaders did was actually go in search of a cross relic. And this is what's being shown in this image. Here you see a different bishop here, again with this funny mitre. They found it probably in early August of 1099. So the Franks believed that this was the relic, the very relic that Heraclius had brought back from Ctesiphon in 629. And they associated specifically thus with the second great story of imperial victory against non-Christian enemies. Unsurprisingly, it was immediately deployed for the ensuing Battle of Ascalon, which was fought 3 weeks later. Arnulf of Shuc, the new patriarch, took possession of the relic. blessing the Crusaders as they prepared to meet the Fatimid forces. 2 years later, during the Crusade of 1101, a cross relic carried into battle by a certain Bishop Gerard, perhaps Gerard of Caesarea, was credited for victory in the battle. And I find this passage pretty evocative, so I'm going to read it. You can read it with me. But he says, here it was certainly clear that the power of the Holy Cross prevails not only against the missiles of invisible enemies, but also against the weapons of the visible. Here we go back to this language of invisible and visible enemies. When the arrogance and the strength of the Gentiles excelled in overcoming the first, the second, the third, and the fourth divisions, yet against the fifth, in which the wood of the holy and reverend cross was being carried before the kings and his comrades, the entire strength of the infidels began to be weakened, to be brought low, and to be trampled underfoot. So this is a passage by Albert of Aachen, canon who remained in Germany, who never saw the battlefield. But it's interesting for the way in which, informed by the liturgy, Albert slides back and forth between spiritual and visible enemies, between earthly and heavenly warfare. So the cross begins in earlier passages as a kind of spiritual protection, but is increasingly credited with just trampling the enemy itself underfoot. The language here is explicitly liturgical. The idea that the cross was, in Albert's language, a spiritual shield against enemy missiles, and soldiers are protected and sanctified. The cross are all verbatim passages taken directly from widely known cross prayers. More so is the idea of the visible and invisible enemies that could be fought also by visible and invisible weapons. This also is a feature of liturgical language. And although in the early years the cross was understood as a weapon against only invisible enemies, it will slowly, and again, I think this has everything to do with the development of the Crusades, come to be understood in a lot of this language as able to fight visible enemies as well. So the stakes had been worked out in the realm of liturgy and theology before 1095, but what I want to insist on here is that the cross relics themselves came increasingly to be understood as battlefield weapons. And I've collected a few examples of this and the description of the power that adheres to specifically cross relics. I want to give you just 3 examples from among more than that. The first is a cross reliquary that Manuel Comnenus had made in the late 12th century to bring into a war against Khiljan Arslan. And the dedicatory inscription, again, I'll read it with you, is of interest. Whoops, there we go. Knowing that Constantine the Great, so again, hearkening back, whose crown was the support of Orthodox faith, obtained victory thanks to the cruciform shape of the divine wood. Manuel I had made the same sign out of gold, in the middle of which he placed the signs, the relics of the Passion and relics of the Venerable Saint, in which he places as much confidence as he does the greatness of his army. Yes, O cross, baton, hit the adversaries. Yes, O cross of Christ, put the Persian tributers to flight and arrange the order of battle around the emperor, crown of his crown with the crown of victory. So again, this idea of the cross itself, the reliquary, the relic of the cross being a baton, something that's gonna fight specifically on the battlefield. A tract about the famous Ponya cross, which was believed to have been carried. This is a relic that ended up at the Ponya monastery. Described it as, although there may be danger in marching forward, the cross is mighty in battle and brings home victory. Without the cross, there is no fight, there is no victory. Who wishes to triumph with Christ must bear it must bear it entirely. And then a contemporary liturgy, that's there. Contemporary liturgy that I just edited for the Sainte-Chapelle speaks about a little relic called the Cross of Victory that Louis IX was believed to have, that Louis IX did acquire from Byzantium in 1242. And the liturgy talks about this specific relic. He got 3 relics, but just the specific relic as the relic that emperors had carried into war. And it reads this: struck by the power of the Lord's cross, the enemy is terrified and expelled far away. Because of this, I adore the Lord the cross of the Lord, in that a piece which emperors carried into battle, and which on account of its power has been proved multiple times in expunging the enemy, and is thus called triumphal. And I've just finished another article about this material, in which Louis, then I'll return to this in a bit, but takes this very cross relic back to war with him when he leaves on crusade in 1248. Okay, so once established and proven in real time, the relic of the cross became one of the central defenses of the Latin East. Alan Murray, Deborah Garish, and Giuseppe Legato have described how the army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem repeatedly brought out the Jerusalem cross. Murray documented 31 instances of the Crusader forces bearing the cross relic into war before its loss in 1187 to Saladin, and more can be added to this. Also in the Principality of Antioch had a cross relic, the Antiochian cross, held at St. Peter's, which was carried into battle until it was lost in 1119 at the Field of Blood. Interesting passage here from Walter the Chancellor that describes in detail how, in preparation for the army's departure, the bishop, William of Jabala, came onto the field, quote, bearing the cross of the holy wood in his reverend hands, circled the whole army, and while he showed it to all of them, he affirmed that they would claim victory in the coming battle through its virtus, through its power. And then the army proceeded to bring that relic into battle. So virtue here, again, means its power, its strength, its fortitude. And what then happens is, in the accounts back home, the narrative accounts of military victories in the Crusades, those victories are routinely attributed specifically to the Virtus Sanctae Cruce. Cross is lost in 1187, but new relics were, of course, brought into battle after that, were found. I don't know of any account that speaks of using a cross relic in the taking of Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade. Now, that is probably because of the suspect character of that conquest. But after the conquest of Constantinople, the new Frankish emperors looked to their ancient cross relic collection that they had just taken possession of, that had aided their Byzantine forebears in early years. So before the fateful Battle of Adrianople in 1205, Baldwin I, the new emperor, sort of at the last minute, seems to have been near the battlefield and said, oh, I need a cross relic. And he sent his chaplain back to the palace to fetch him a relic of the true cross, quote, which the emperors had customarily carried into battle when fighting their enemies, so that they might triumph over their foes by reason of the power of the Holy Cross. And I will move quickly through this because I don't want to overstay my time, but we've got plenty of examples that this occurred in the Fifth Crusade. And then again, as I mentioned earlier, Louis IX took his little Constantinian relic with him in 1248. Practice isn't confined to the Levant. I have hardly completed a catalog of all references, and if you should come across one, please send it to me. But the examples that follow point, I think, pretty clearly to the fact that this had become a widespread practice associated particularly, I think, with holy war. So the Georgians adopted the practice in the 12th century, probably in imitation of the Franks in Iberia in 1134. During a period when the Reconquista was being turned into crusade, Alfonso I, the King of Aragon, brought a purloined cross relic into the Battle of Fraga against the Almoravids. I want to give a call out to one of my students for providing me that information. The author of the famous account of the conquest of Lisbon in 1147 recounts holding up a relic of the true cross before the troops and saying that under this standard, under this vexillum, they will conquer and that they can be certain of victory. We can continue with a litany of other examples. So the Battle of Las Navas at Tolosa against the Almohads in 1212 sees Alfonso VIII's his cavalry charging into battle behind a relic. Albigensian Crusade sees Simon de Montfort marching behind a relic of the True Cross. In the 14th century, we have the example recently explored by our own Dirceu Marchini of the Battle of Rio Salado. Oops, I'm behind here. This is the relic of the famous, their relic of the true cross known as the Santo Lenho that was held by the Hospitallers that was called into battle a generation later in 1365. On the other side of the Mediterranean, we have Peter Thomas carrying a cross relic into war during Peter the Cyprus' campaign against Alexandria. Keep going. Crusade of Varna. The Varna Crusade in 1443 has the example of the papal legate, Julian Cesarini, taking a relic onto the battlefield. And then 2 decades later, Pope Paul II sends Matthias Corvinus relics in a golden reliquary for him to take into battle. And again, please, if you have other examples, send them to me. I am collecting them. So with that, let me just sum up. Crusaders, of course, marked themselves with the sign of the cross as a spiritual protection. Here you have a glorious crusader marked all over with a cross, him and his horse. But this is different than carrying the thing itself, the relic in its material form, into battle as a weapon. And this is what I mean by the cross of war. So scholars in the last 2 generations have explored in many ways the idea of the power of the saints who can intervene with God on behalf of men, and the power of their relics in whose substance that saintly power was concentrated and stored. But the cross relic falls into a slightly different category than the relics of the saints, because it was not the means to access the saint who had accessed God, but rather it was the cross itself in its very material form that was the powerful thing. The cross was the mechanism of Christ's victory over the devil and the means of victory through Christ himself. So more than other relics and reliquaries, the cross was the new Ark of the Covenant, and medieval authors are very explicit about this. It is the place of God's most immediate presence in the world of men. This is why Alfonso the Battler's cross relic, which he carried into the Battle of Braga in 1134, was actually encased in an ark-shaped reliquary, making the point that the cross relic, was the new Ark of the Covenant, right? The Ark of the new dispensation. So possessing a cross relic, the Ark of the Covenant, meant that God himself, with his most vital weapon, was right there with you. So this is why the Franks were so horrified on the eve of the Battle of Hattin, because on the 2nd of July, as they prepared to meet Saladin in battle, right after Guy of Lusignan had the cross brought to him in his tent, the great cross relic, the tent of the Patriarch, that night during the performance of the liturgy, the cleric reciting the liturgy read a line, probably from 1 Kings, that the chronicler reports as saying the Ark of the Covenant was taken by the Philistines in battle and carried off. And then the chronicler adds that the hearts of all those who heard this and understood were immediately struck with fear. Because, of course, the liturgy here presaged the unthinkable, that Christ himself would not offer his protection nor offer them the means of his victory, that the cross, the Ark, Christ himself, would abandon the Crusaders on the field, and that his most potent weapon against any enemy, right, the weapon of the cross, would be denied the Crusaders' cross. It was like leaving a cannon unfired or a missile not taken out from the arsenal. Because without Christ's most powerful weapon, they very well knew that they were thus helpless to destruction by the minions of the devil. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Gaposchkin, for such a fascinating presentation about the relic of the cross in the Crusadings and the different roles it plays, because it's almost an actor, not only an object inside the battlefield. And we have already quite a few questions. So I will read them to you. Ettore asks, in view of the clash between Christians and Muslims forces in the period of the Crusades, how was the symbol of the cross itself known in the Islamic world after this event?
Yeah, great question. I mean, this is all well understood by people other than me. Once the Muslims had understood that this was it happened very quickly, religious war on the part of the Crusaders. They came to call it the Cross Wars. And my understanding is that the Arabic phrase for this set is like the Cross Wars. And they understood that the cross was clearly critical to both Christian, the belief system, but also specifically the cross to the Crusades, to this particular campaign itself. And so they would, insult the cross. Comes from Christian propaganda or Christian writing, the idea that there was sort of a lack of respect for the cross, but they completely understood. What I don't know is whether there's any particular sort of thinking about the fact of cross relics as opposed to just the cross as a sign or the cross as a symbol, with the one exception, of course, that they take the relic at the Battle of Hattin, and it seems to have disappeared. I mean, as far as I can tell, they held it out for in negotiations. So this is in 1187, Saladin, the Ayyubids capture the cross, and they seem to hold it out as part of as a bargaining chip in future negotiations. But it never reappears. And I've been tracing the number of references to the cross as it exists, and it seems it's a very live issue for the first generation after Hattin, but by the 2 generations on, people aren't talking about it. Sort of leaves the rhetoric, as does Saladin for that matter. So in the Islamic world, they absolutely understood the importance of the cross and the importance of the cross to the Christian cause and the sort of Christian identity in that sense.
Thank you. And Luis Eduardo Pegoraro asked, how did the Byzantines see the true cross in the hands of the Crusaders in the 12th century, since they were the possessors of the relic?
So I'm not 100% sure I understand the details of the question. Of course, there were many, 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 many relics of the true cross. Famously, I don't remember if it was Calvin or Voltaire who said that, bring all the relics of the true cross together and you've got the Bois de Boulogne. I'm not exactly sure. So they have a whole series of relics in Constantinople, but in theory, there were other relics in Jerusalem. Somebody else might know, and I mean, there might have been some work done on this. What's interesting is that it's hard. You can't trace cross relics. You can't say like this one was that one. Like Helena had discovered a cross, and then she left a piece here, and she sent a piece there, and then that got split up because it's just too murky. And so sometimes you can figure out what happened to one piece and what role it did. But it is curious, the relic that the Crusaders discovered after the taking of Jerusalem in 1099. It's not clear what pedigree it had or how much external confidence it had, or outside of the Crusader forces themselves, whether it was considered suspect. But there were obviously a lot of cross relics going around. In Byzantium, they had a whole bunch of cross relics, and after 1204, after the Fourth Crusade, they flood the market, and attempts to pin down how many relics were in Constantinople. I mean, there are tons of them. So,
okay,
I'm not sure if that's well.
We move on to the next question. Fernando Olival asks, can you explain the beginning of the Feast of the Exaltation of the Cross? It was in the 17th century that the Exaltation of the Cross was introduced as patron of the Order of Christ in Portugal.
Interesting. Okay, well, so this follows on very, very good work by Stephen Borghammer and John von Tengeren and sort of liturgical historians who have worked through it. It seems to be that from a very early stage, from about the 4th century, there was a Feast of the Exaltation of the Cross in Jerusalem. Ageria, the 4th century pilgrim, attests to it in her long, very informative description of the liturgy that happens in Jerusalem. It's not clear whether it was adopted outside of Jerusalem or in Byzantium until the 7th century. It's clear that after Heraclius's return, his success in the 620s, 629, the story of that seems to have been an inspiration. We have evidence in both Constantinople and also in Rome early on in the 7th century, sort of like before 750 in the first half of the 7th century, of a new celebration of the Feast of the Exaltation. One thought is that the Exaltation is adopted. So Heraclius comes back, he brings the relic back, then he goes back to Constantinople, but then with the Arab invasions, he says, like, let's bring it to Constantinople, don't leave it in Jerusalem. And it seems to be at that stage that it became an important feast in Constantinople. And then it very quickly moves. So then you have two feasts. You have the Feast of the Invention of the Cross, which celebrates, and the stories, the lectionary, the story that it's clearly retelling is about Helen's discovery of the cross in the 4th century, which seemed to have been in Northern Europe, in Gallican areas. And then the Exaltation comes to Rome, and very soon, within 100 years, you really have many churches celebrating both of them. So you have a feast on May 3rd, and then a feast on September 14th. That tell the two stories, one of Constantine's victory and Helen's discovery of the cross, and then Heraclius's return of the cross, or saving of the cross.
Fascinating, thank you. And the Sociedades de Estudos de Cruzadas y Órdenes Militares, who I suspect is Dirceu Marchini or Bruno, ask, are there any sources regarding Muslim perception of the Latin civilization of the relic of the cross? Oh, it's Bruno who is asking.
Yeah, so this again sort of touches on the earlier question of Muslim perceptions of the cross itself, and it's actually a very good question. And I will admit that I haven't done that. I haven't looked for that, and so I should go look for that. Again, I think you'll see, my guess would be, we'll find a fair amount specifically around the Third Crusade because of the recognition of what a catastrophe it was for the Frankish cause. But I would have to start, and I couldn't do this in the original, so I would have to work through translating languages. And actually, it's a very good point, which I should take on. So I apologize for an empty answer, but it's a productive question for me. Yeah.
Are there any more questions? Yeah. Etere asked, was there some form of rejection of the symbol of the cross and the religion itself through the possibility of persecution of the Copts in Egypt and the Eastern Christian in the Levant by the Islamics?
Sorry, can you either give it back to me on the screen? Was there some form of rejection?
Yeah. Was there some form of rejection of the symbol of the cross and the religion itself, which would translate into the persecution of the Copts in Egypt and the Eastern Christians in the Levant by the Islamics? So it's about the...
Go ahead.
Yeah, how the... what I understand of the question is how the presence of the cross does affect these other Christian communities, which are not directly involved in the Crusades, but are attached to the same symbol.
Yeah, again, the cross is such a ubiquitous symbol for Christianity. So I don't have a good answer to those specific questions. I mean, I know, for instance, in the Coptic context a bit later, there was a desire and a trade for relics. This wonderful new book by Vera Krebs on the trade between the Egyptian. I'm sorry. Here I'm thinking that the Ethiopian trade and desire for relics, and I don't have a sort of. I can't connect that to. I mean, I can't connect my material. Certainly, the cross itself is ubiquitous. The thing that's interesting to me is that the cross is within crusading. I mean, crosses in general, associated with pilgrimage and Christic suffering a lot of the time. Both early on, And then increasingly, this is work I did for an earlier project, increasingly in the 12th and 13th century, it becomes symbolic of this idea of walking in Christ's footsteps, of the passion of Christ and crusading as part of that salvific and penitential strain. And certainly, you know, it's not one or the other. There's always these multi registers and sort of parallel discourses that feed into one another. What I'm trying to do here specifically is think about specifically relics. Like, what is it about? So one of the problems in the sources, or one of the challenges of the sources, is that there's a lot of references that speak about signum crucis, so the sign of the cross, or just the or just the cross, you know, the form of the cross. And it's not, I'm sorry, and also vexillum crucis. And vexillum is this really terrific, potent, pregnant, tricky word, because it comes to mean cross, but in its original form it means battle standard. And then so when you talk about the vexillum crucis, are you talking about sort of metaphorically the sign of the cross, the faith, the commitment, or are you talking about a battle standard with a cross on it, or are you just talking about a battle standard? And so there's a way in which that language both enriches a lot of the discourse, but it can also make it not always clear. Like, of course, they all marched into battle under the sign of the cross, right? All armies, all crusading armies march under sub vexillum crucis. That's definitional. Doesn't mean they were marching out with the battle. So I really try to attend to examples in language that are specifically around the material, the form itself, because what's I'm interested in specifically for this project is, what does the relic, how is it understood that the relic sort of contained or created this mode, this sort of vector of heavenly power, which wasn't just symbolic. Now I've veered far away from the question, but it's by way of trying to explain that the project isn't about the cross, right?
Yeah.
Not about the image of the cross or the symbolism of the cross in you know, crusading society. People have done that. I've done that. It's been, you know, we know that answer. It's about the specific use of like possessing this thing, which is both the cross, but it's also more than that, and it's doing more than just the image. So.
Yeah. And picking up on that and abusing from my role as chair of this session, I would like to pose my own question, which is in this line, because what I understood from what you have explained, the relics of the cross have kind of a dual role in the battle. They act as a defensive element that defends the Christian troops, but also as an offensive kind of weapon. And my question would be, do both appear at the same time, or does one develop earlier than the other in the sources? Can we trace that? Because the cross as an offensive weapon is something that, yes, it's in the iconography, but, you know, used against other people, other humans. It's I wonder how does that develop, if it appears later or if it appears from the beginning. Could you expand on that if you have?
Yeah, so it's exactly the right question, and it is a complicated one. And so the cross as a defense and as a shield is common early on, and I'm still working this out. It is clear that it can be a protection on earth, and it can be an eschatological weapon early on. That there is an uneasiness with the idea of having it in this offensive role on earth, but the slippage, but it is still Christ's weapon against the devil. And it is over time that you see. So early on, and again, I don't know whether this is 100% and always true, but the trending is very clear that early on, you hear a lot about it against the ancient enemy or invisible enemies. And slowly you get the development. It's really 9th century, you know, if you trust the database, you know, the PL, you know, those sort of readings. It's around the 9th century that you begin to see invisible and visible weapons. And so there seems to be this sort of slow seeping in. your question is exactly why I was so struck by the image that I showed you in the middle of Heraclius piercing Khosrow's with the sword, because that is such a blatant use of an offensive weapon. And that was when I began precisely to answer that question, which is being protected by the sign of the cross. You see all over the place, both iconographically and in the language, it being a weapon. Again, it's not like there's no uses of it, but the uses of it tend to be explicitly eschatological in the earlier period. And I don't know, I wouldn't be willing to say right now when that moment of change was. My sense is it's Carolingian, or it's or it's specifically with the Crusades, somewhere between the 9th and the 11th century, you begin to see that language. But you also have a lot more evidence, right? You have a lot more people writing about it. And that's also where my liturgical evidence starts, right? We don't really have much before the 8th or 9th century. And that's where I'm seeing a lot of the evidence. And so one theory, one hypothesis is that it is in this field, the sort of more fluid development of the creation of these prayers within the Carolingian. And again, this is the Latin language. I haven't done the Greek. I haven't, sort of, but within the sphere of the development of the Carolingian promotion of liturgy and the Carolingian ideology of Christian imperial warfare, where you're beginning to see the language play itself out as more explicitly militaristic.
Thank you. That's fascinating. And with that, I think we have to wrap up this session. Okay. I would like to thank again Professor Gaposchkin for such a fascinating talk, and her patience with all the questions and all the illuminating answers, and all the participants for their presence and their questions here. And I hope they will join us for the rest of the seminar this week. So with that,
to you for such lovely moderation, and again to the organizers for such a terrific conference.
Thank you. So good afternoon and good evening, depending on where you are, and we hope we see you in the next session.